Welcome to another class. This is our Exegesis and Exposition of Romans class that's offered through Maranatha Baptist University and Maranatha Baptist Seminary. Here we're studying the overall argument of the book of Romans, trying to get at the heart of what the Apostle Paul is teaching us through this book. And here we are, in a sense, at the heart of the book. Some would say it's somewhere between chapter 3, 4, and 5 is where Paul really dives into the heart of the gospel. And we're going to see in chapter 3 that we often have, Romans chapter 3, verse 23 memorized, all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And of course that has a context. But the heart of the gospel is what we see in chapter 3. And in this short video, we're just going to take a look at some of the grammatical highlights, which I think will help us appreciate the message of chapter 3. Let's first take a look at a verb that appears in verse 2. You can notice that it's from pisteuo, which means I have faith in, or I trust, or I believe. It's got the augment here at the front, and it's got the sigma alpha, which means it's an aorist verb. It's got the nous, so it's third person plural. And then we see the little theta eta there, which means it's aorist passive. So the idea is they were entrusted with. And here he's saying, well, what is the advantage of the Jew if we're making the argument that all have sinned, even in Jews who could pretty easily boast in their religious heritage and the fact that they're God's chosen people, they're descendants of Abraham? What then is the advantage if everybody has sinned? And he says, well, much in pretty much every way. First of all, because it says, because they were entrusted with, is the idea, the words of God. Or we could even translate logia as the oracles of God. He's talking about the Old Testament, mainly the Mosaic Law, but also the writings of the prophets. What's interesting here is this passive voice verb goes along with his overall argument because he's saying the Jews can't boast in their good works as they've traditionally done. Whatever they have, first of all, this is something God did for them, and he had a specific purpose. They can't boast in the fact that they trusted God because on a national level, historically, they more often than not have not trusted God. It says their first advantage is the fact that they were entrusted with. God did this for them. They were entrusted with the oracles or the words of God. So the fact that this is passive ties in an important way with his overall argument as he made it in chapter 2 and as he's continuing it here in chapter 3. We're going to see, beginning in verse 3, a series of questions, and this is just a grammatical reminder, that when we see a question being made and it starts with may, the anticipated response is in the negative, is no. And that's pretty obvious, because here, for instance, he's saying, well, is it the case then that their unbelief, the faith of God nullified? Did their unbelief nullify the faithfulness of God towards them? And then he answers with a very clear negative here. Me genoita, may it never be. This is about the strongest way you can say, no, never. May it never be. So in verse 3, he asks this question because some people could erroneously conclude, well, maybe their unfaithfulness has nullified the faithfulness of God. Well, no, that's definitely not what happened. We just need to understand a little bit more God's plan. And then he says here in verse 5, when he earlier asked the question, he says, and if our unrighteousness commends the righteousness of God, or if God uses our unrighteousness to highlight his own righteousness, well, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous if he carries out wrath upon us, if he judges us? And again, it starts with the may here. The anticipated response is no. As we see in verse 6, it's me genoita. He asks another question down here in verses 7 and 8. It doesn't have the same grammatical form beginning with the may, but still the expected response is no. For instance, he says here, and isn't it not true that it would end up being this, that just as we're blasphemed, people say this about us, it's not true. And they affirm that we say, that we teach, that let us do evil in order that good might come. And he says, well, people who do that or think that, their judgment is just. It is just. And of course, that question expects a negative response. Of course, we're not going to say that let's do evil so that good might come. And what is the heart of this passage, verses 21 through 26, he introduces it by quoting two very important Old Testament prophets. And what we see from this is that in the gospel, we don't have anything that's changing Old Testament norms or Old Testament theology. or Old Testament law. Because what the Apostle Paul now is going to do, starting in verse 10, he's going to show us how the gospel is embedded in the law itself. Because two very important people in Old Testament times, David and King David and the prophet David and the prophet Isaiah, are going to condemn their own countrymen, descendants of Abraham, for not being righteous, for not seeking after God. And he makes it very clear. Now, these are citations, but check out how it begins. He says, uk estin, righteous. There's not one righteous. Uk estin. He says, uk estin, one who understands. There's no one who understands. And he says 11 again, uk estin, one who is seeking God. There is no one who is seeking after God. So just a little litany of expressions, powerful pointed expressions. Uk estin, uk estin, uk estin. Again in verse 12 he says uk estin, uk estin. And then he ends these citations with one more. Uk estin, there is no fear of God before their eyes. Just in case there were some religious people, generally and specifically Jews, who thought that they were righteous because of their religious inheritance, the Apostle Paul is dashing that to pieces by quoting two of the perhaps most respected Old Testament people, and that is David and the prophet Isaiah. And they speak in very clear terms. Uk estin, uk estin, uk estin. Sometimes when we go from one language to the next, for instance, in English, we have a double negative, and that becomes a positive. But it's not always that way. It's not that way in Greek normally. And for instance, in Spanish too, you get a double negative. It just means it's that much more negative. But here we have something that if we translate it literally, we might kind of miss the point, even though context makes it rather clear. He says, wherefore, by the works of the law shall not be justified all flesh. So we could maybe literally translate that. All flesh shall not be justified. So we've got the pasa, modifying sarx, pas pasapan. This is one that follows a 3-1-3 pattern. Third declension if it's masculine or neuter, and second declension if it's feminine. But pasa here is second declension. It's modifying a feminine noun, sarx. So it ends up being pasa, all, sarx, flesh. And all flesh will not be justified before him or in his presence. The idea isn't necessarily that all flesh won't be justified. The idea is, as most translations translate, there's among all flesh, no one is going to be justified. So no one among all flesh will be justified in his presence, because through the law is the knowledge, epignosis, of sin. So here we have two of the most important Old Testament personalities telling us that, and their writings form part of the law. They're saying the law is not enough to justify. If you're a person even who's inherited all of the religious riches, like the Jews, it's not enough to justify. And the law itself is a testimony to that fact. And that is the point. When we get down here in verse 21, he's going to say, now, apart from the law or without the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested. So here we have on one side that the righteousness of God comes apart from the law, and specifically how a Jew views the law as being a person who's inherited the law culturally, religiously, even politically. That is not enough to attain righteousness. The righteousness of God comes apart from all of that. And then he says, but this fact is testified by the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets themselves have the gospel embedded within them, as we see when we read some of David's and Isaiah's writings, and in fact all the prophets give testimony to this fact. The righteousness that God gives, he says, is through the faith of Jesus Christ. Here's an important expression here. Dia pisteos Jesu Christu. There's a lot of debate, specifically when we see pisteos with dia, whether it's someone who puts their faith in Jesus Christ, or if he's talking about the faith of Jesus Christ. For instance, if we applied it here, the righteousness of God through, is this the faith that Jesus Christ had, or is this the faith that people put in Jesus Christ? And as I've read through many times this expression appears in the New Testament, my sense is sometimes, first of all, it's not clear. Second of all, it may be inconsequential because the context often invokes the faithfulness of Jesus Christ And the man's right response to Jesus Christ's faithfulness is faith in his name. And these two really work together. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if sometimes both of these were in Paul's mind when he wrote an expression like the faith of Jesus Christ. But sometimes there's other contextual indicators that will show us, oh, he's talking more about the faith we put in Jesus Christ, or he's talking more about Jesus Christ's own faithfulness. And we just want to keep an eye open for those contextual indicators. Down here in verse 25, he says, whom God, the subject there in the nominative case, set forth as a ilasterion. This is what happened above the mercy seat or the top of the Ark of the Covenant. It was when the blood was sprinkled to represent the forgiveness of sin. He says, God set forth Christ as a ilasterion through faith in his blood, in order to show forth the righteousness of him, or his righteousness. And then we have dia with the accusative. So dia with the accusative is generally translated because of or on account of. And then this is the object of the preposition here is paresin, which is an interesting word, which has the idea of passing over or not taking into account. And so he says, to show forth his righteousness on account of the fact that he looked over or he didn't take into account the sins that were committed before. So he's talking about what Jesus did. He's talking about the sins that were committed in the Old Testament. Well, what happened in the Old Testament? Well, lambs and other animals were offered continually as a sacrifice for sin. And as the argument of Hebrews goes, these things had to continually happen. And one gets the idea that sin was never finally dealt with in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, in other words, the final solution to show forth God's righteousness to the world was in the works, and just the right time Christ came. And that's the sense then, when we come down to verse 26, of God's righteousness. A lot of New Testament introductions will say the main theme of the book of Romans is God's righteousness. And I think that's a good conclusion. We see here in verse 26 that in the forbearance of God, in order to show forth his righteousness, there's that word, dikaiosune, in the present time. And then here again we have eis ta plus the infinitive. A lot of times we see eis, we think, oh, it's in or among. Well, when it's with the neuter article and the infinitive, it's actually purpose or result. And here, in order that he might be, enai is literally to be, but when it occurs with an infinitive like this, sometimes it needs to be transformed into more of an indicative or subjunctive idea. In order that he might be, there's the he, and it's in the accusative. But that's because when an infinitive has a subject, it's going to appear in the accusative case. In order that he might be just, and the one. Now here's another form of, here's dikaion, right? It has the same root as dikaiosune. And it's an adjective in this case, modifying him in order that he might be just. And also, the one who is justifying, the one who has, or even the one who is justified by faith in Jesus or the faith of Jesus. If we want to kind of be non-committal, we could always put the faith of Jesus and let the reader determine whether it's Jesus' faith or faith in Jesus. When I see this dual role that God has played in the person of his Son Jesus Christ, proving himself to be just and also being the only means through which sinful human beings can be justified, it makes me think of verses like Ephesians 5:27 that talk about Jesus presenting to himself a glorious church without spot or wrinkle. In other words, our righteousness comes from Jesus Christ. God proved himself just when he provided the final solution for sin in the death of his Son. And he also is the reason why sinful human beings can be justified. And that's why we love and worship him so much, because he plays both of these roles. There's a lot we could say. This is an awesome chapter, and it's filled with some awesome truths. But I want to take a look at one last thing in verse 30. And it says here, since it is one God who will justify the circumcision by faith, ek pisteos, and the uncircumcision through faith. Well, let me go real quick to Romans chapter 1:17. Because here we see an interesting dual expression of this idea of being justified by faith. It says, "For the righteousness of God in this is revealed ek pisteos eis pistin," from faith unto faith. We've made another video that kind of goes into detail exegetically about this question and how to resolve it. But the big question here is, well, ek pisteos, is this like referring to Jews? Like Jews who have the law can be justified out of the law. They still have to go through Jesus Christ. But they kind of have this divine law background, which gives them some advantages. And so they're justified by faith or from faith, which kind of is embedded in the law, unto faith. In other words, the Gentiles, through receiving the gospel, are brought from unbelief into faith. And this is kind of an expression that deals with the different backgrounds of Jews versus the Gentiles. And there's some arguments that we could make contextually. I think the consensus is that, well, ek pisteos eis pistin, is just maybe an idiomatic expression that meant faith from head to toe. I think that's a good take on it. I think it's possible, though, that this is kind of referring to the Jewish background of faith when Jews put their faith in Christ, and possibly this more of a reference to what he says up here, to the Jew first and to the Greek, and then there's a parallel expression, from faith to faith. That's a possibility. And one of the contextual arguments would be what we just saw in chapter 3, where he uses the same expression, ek pisteos, to talk about how the circumcision can be justified out of faith or from faith. And then he says the uncircumcision through faith. So the question is it exegetically significant that he chose ek pisteos for the Jews and diates pisteos for the Gentiles? Well, maybe. It certainly deserves our attention. It certainly deserves some thought. In verse 31, the Apostle Paul basically summarizes what he's trying to teach us throughout this chapter, and that is the gospel was already embedded within the law. The law is what shows us our need for Christ, and through that mechanism which God has provided, it should help us recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. But he asks this question, well, therefore, do we abolish the law through faith? Me genoita, strongest way you can say no way in Greek. May it never be. What's happening here is that we actually, through faith in Jesus Christ, who is the completion of the law, we estanomen, we stand in or we establish the law. Is there any contradiction between the gospel of Jesus Christ and everything that happened in the Old Testament, its message and its meaning? Absolutely not.